5 seconds. And over the mic is all fueling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha. Stand by, camera 1.
I'm Thom Hartmann, and on this show we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying a problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera, go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture. Hello, I'm Thom Hartmann in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. While Americans were busy enjoying this past weekend, the Supreme Court was busy dealing another blow to voting rights in our country. What did they rule on, and what does that decision mean for voting rights going forward? And 13 years after 9/11, the war on terror has turned into a massive money-making scheme for America's oligarchs. How did this happen, and what can we do to change it? I'll ask Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Risen in tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. You need to know this. With just under 2 weeks to go until Election Day, the race for governor of Florida is about as close as it could be. Polling shows that Democrat Charlie Crist and incumbent Republican Governor Rick Scott are neck and neck. But while polls might show the candidates deadlocked, the two offer very different views for the future of the Sunshine State and of America. For example, Rick Scott is strongly opposed toward expanding Medicaid under Obamacare so that tens of thousands of Floridians can have access to affordable, life-saving health care. But the differences between the two men don't just stop there. Joining me now to talk more about the Florida gubernatorial election and the choice Floridians have come Election Day is America's lawyer, Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire Radio, Ring of Fire TV. Pap, welcome back.
Thom, how are you?
Just great. Great to have you with us. Are you surprised that this race is so tight going into the final stretch?
Amazed. Anybody that understands the background of these two people would they're flabbergasted that it's 43-43 or 44-44 when you have the history that this character Rick Scott carries. But you know, there's an interesting thing happening here. I noticed it today talking to some people that have been working the campaign. First of all, I mean, I think this is the reason Florida is important. Let me begin there. The reason Florida is important is because it is going to determine how the presidential election goes in 2016. Interesting quote by Chris Christie today. He comes out and he says, you know what? We have to control the states so we can suppress votes, so we can control the voting mechanism, is what he said. But what he was trying to say is we have to control the states, state by state, so a governor like Rick Scott in Florida or Scott Walker, well, they can determine who votes and who doesn't vote. So that's why Florida is important. It's important for the presidential election. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing the Democrats really in this enough down here in Florida. Yeah. And that's a little bit of a disappointment. I mean, this should be the place where they're all hands on deck, and they're really, you know, maybe they're going to be the last week and a half. We'll see. Yeah,
and apropos of that, back in 2000, just, you know, a few months before the election, Governor Jeb Bush ordered Katherine Harris to knock 80,000 African Americans off the voting rolls. Had she not done that, in all probability, it's a certainty, had she not done that, Al Gore would have overwhelmingly beat. It wouldn't have been close enough for the Supreme Court to steal.
No question. But that's what they're talking about. When you have a guy like Chris Christie, who is just a bottom-feeding operator in the way that he views politics, when he says we have to have a state like Florida, we have to have a governor like Rick Scott, who already has shown what he's about. I mean, again, you can't say it too many times. You know, $1.7 billion for stealing from taxpayers. And nevertheless, he's elected down there in Florida. So all of a sudden, Chris Christie says, hey, this is great. If we can do that in more states, we can control the White House along with controlling the House of Representatives.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I want to just check here's a clip of the infamous Fangate debate from last week. Here it is.
Governor Christ has asked to have a fan, a small fan, placed underneath his podium. The rules of the debate that I was shown by the Scott campaign say that there should be no fan. Somehow there is a fan there, and for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, I am being told that Governor Scott will not join us for this debate.
Right. What astounded me the most about that, Pap, and I haven't seen reported anywhere other than my going off on it for 3 days in a row on radio and television, was that 4 years ago, Rick Scott was in a dead heat and maybe even losing, and the woman that he was, Alex Sink was her name, wasn't it?
Very weak candidate, yes.
Yeah,
Alex Sink,
but the woman that he was, it was a debate. And during the break in the debate, her assistant came out and showed her a text message on a phone, and Alex Sink read that off the phone, and then her assistant went away. And Rick Scott went ballistic about it and said that she was cheating using an electronic device. And that became the only thing that the media talked about for about a week, and it allowed all the issues of the debate to just vanish. So it didn't matter what Rick Scott said. It didn't matter what the positions he was taking, because everybody was talking about whether or not Alex Sink had cheated in the debate. And it looks to me like with his going off on the fan thing, he's saying, oh, he's cheating with an electronic device. He was trying to replicate what he did 4 years ago. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, it is. Look, you have an ADD in the media these days. If you think of the issues that were thrown out in that debate, where we were talking about hundreds of thousands of people losing their job in Florida because of Rick Scott. We talked about the Medicaid being at risk in Florida because of Rick Scott. Fracking taking place, offshore drilling. But nevertheless, the media has such an ADD problem that they simply take that low-hanging fruit and they make it into a story. And you have a unique situation, Tom. You have extraordinary producers. It's not that these producers with ABC and NBC, that they don't have the talent to do it. It is that they've become this culture. It's an ADD culture of trying to get to the most ridiculous point because it's easy to do. And you have the luxury, fortunately I have the luxury of having producers that understand what the big stories are, and they would never allow that to happen. But unfortunately, that is the nature of political news nowadays.
Yeah, it's amazing. Talking about elections, it's hard not to talk about the ongoing Republican voter suppression efforts around the country. What's your take on the Supreme Court's decision this past weekend to uphold Texas's voter suppression law? 600,000 people.
Yeah, 4 years ago, it would have been reasonable to believe that the SCOTUS majority of Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, Alito, and Kennedy, that the Republican political hacks, that they were maybe intellectual to some degree. It might have been reasonable to believe that they were maybe following some semblance of judicial methodology. But now we saw what they did, and we could even say, well, maybe there was a reason for it. Today, you'd have to be mentally challenged to see that this SCOTUS majority is there simply, I mean, they're there to protect a dead, dying, gray, feeble remnant of the Republican Party. So what do? They remove their white sheets. We start seeing who Clarence Thomas or Alito really is, and we see that they're limited on talent, they're limited on character, they're limited on intellect. That's really more very important here. Out of that, this election, 2014, is going to be the first time we're going to see 15 new states face brand new restrictions for the first time in midterm elections, completely designed to make the act of voting so difficult that voting while black, voting while Hispanic or young or disabled or elderly, that they prefer a retro world of white folks only at the polls. North Carolina. Think about it. Same-day voting and registration, gone. It's how people used to vote. Out-of-precinct voting, gone, to target students and active military. A person shows up, he's in the active military, has a card, says, I'm in the military. No, you can't vote because you don't have our special ID. Texas, as you've talked about on your show a few times already, 600,000 registered voters that would be ordinarily able to vote are told, no, you can't vote, because the Republican-packed circuit court determined it's just fine to tell 600,000 voters, registered by the way, that they're going to have this new improved ID card. That's the nature, not of just the Supreme Court, but all of these packed federal courts that we've allowed to take place over the last 12 years.
Yeah. That's amazing. I want to get your take on one last thing. During a recent episode of his radio show, conservative talk show host Michael Weiner, who performs under the name Michael Savage, went on an epic rant against people suffering from depression and PTSD as a consequence of military service. Take a listen.
I am so sick and tired of everyone with their complaints about PTSD, depression. Everyone wants their hand held and a check, a government check. What are you, the only generation that PTSD? The only generation that's depressed? I'm sick of it. I can't take the celebration of weakness and depression. See, I was raised a little differently. I was raised to fight weakness. I was raised to fight pain. I was raised to fight depression, not to give into it, not to cave into it and cry like a little baby in bed. Boo-hoo-hoo! Boo-hoo-hoo!
All right, so, Pat, we got a minute and a half. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a guy who was raised getting red bellies in noogies because he was such a geek. This is a kid grew up with the name Michael Weiner. So he says, I'm going to change it to Mike Savage. That tells you something right there. But what he said about these people who have served in the military, active duty people coming back disabled of all types of things, not just PTSD. What he's saying is, I didn't serve. This guy never served. He's never picked up a gun. He's never been in any kind of harm's way. Think of how vulgar it is for him to criticize these people. It doesn't stop there with him. Think about this. He is somebody who said that autism is a racket, that it's just made up so poor people can get money from the government. Right. He's a guy who said that, there's 1 billion Muslims, so we can kill 100 million of them, and we're going to be just fine dealing with only 900 million. In other words, his point was, it's just fine to kill 100 million because there's plenty more where that came from. This is a guy, the question in my mind that kicks around every time I hear anything about Michael Weenie Savage is, how dare somebody have the notion of thinking it's just completely proper to advertise with this guy or to even have him on the air. That's what this culture has become, and it's a very scary thing to me, Tom.
Yeah. Mike Papantoni, always great to see you, Pap. Thanks.
Thank you.
Coming up, a decade ago, billions of dollars meant for the reconstruction of Iraq vanished without a trace. Now, years later, some of that money has turned up in Lebanon. How did this happen? And what does this say about the war on terror and where it went wrong? I'll ask Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Rice in a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds right after the break.
I'm Erin Ade. The financial world moves fast.
What kind of impact do you see these developments having on stocks?
The big banks will only take
There's
on
no
more
demand for credit. You're not going to get any economic benefit.
In life, there are booms and there are busts.
I'm the resident, and I know words are powerful. Words like cheap, as in people who buy the crap our media sells us are acting like a bunch of sheep. Or words like greedy, as in our entire financial system is rigged by a bunch of greedy jerks. Or words like consumers, as in there's more to life than just being gluttonous consumers. I'm the resident, and I'm fighting idiocy one carefully chosen word at a time.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy.
Covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
I'm Abby Martin. The stories we cover here, you're not going to hear anywhere else.
Another big story that mainstream headlines seem to have
There's a
missed.
reason they don't want you to know.
Nothing in the report detailing the reason.
We should all be completely outraged.
Now let's break the set.
Welcome to Your Take, My Take Live. If you want to get in on the conversation, ask me a question, make a comment, send us your videos to yourtakemytake@gmail.com. You can tweet them at Thom_Hartmann using the hashtag #TalkToThom or post a message on the ThomHartmann.com message boards. First comment of the night comes from Ultrax, who posted this on our message board. Imagine you're volunteering for a phone bank to get out the Democratic vote this election. What's the best argument you can make in 30 seconds to convince an unenthusiastic voter that they need to vote? Well, I would say, particularly for those people who think that elections aren't important and that, well, why should I bother? Ask the question, why is it that the billionaires and the corporations are spending millions, hundreds of millions, tens of, over $1 billion actually through the last election cycle to try to influence elections? And they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't think that elections were really and truly important. So it's pretty straightforward stuff, I think, and pretty important. So, no, let's move along. My guest for tonight's Conversations with Great Minds is one of America's most fearless investigative journalists, New York Times reporter James Risen, the winner of the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting, as well as the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for Explanatory Reporting. James has quite literally changed history with some of his stories. His 2005 report on the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program, for example, sparked a nationwide debate on privacy and the war on terror, a debate that we're still having today. James is also the author of a number of best-selling books, including his latest, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War, a must-read expose on corruption and the war on terror. James Risen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us. We've talked on my radio show over the years a few times, and it's, I have so much respect for the work that you've been doing all these years.
Thank you.
I'd like to actually start out asking about you. What provokes someone, or what stimulated you to become a reporter?
Well, it's the only thing I've ever done. I've been a reporter since I got out of college, and I realized when I was in college I was working for the school magazine and doing some work for the local city newspaper that it's just something I really enjoyed. I loved going out and talking to people and finding out their stories and then telling them. It's a great job. I mean, you have a lot of independence and freedom, and you get to go meet people and find out their stories.
And then your government tries to put you in jail.
Yeah. I didn't expect that part of it.
Yeah, not to make such a shockingly rapid segue, but your new book is titled "Pay Any Price," and I'm assuming you're referring to Jack Kennedy's. In fact, here's a clip of it. Here's Jack Kennedy saying this.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Now, somehow I am guessing that when Jack Kennedy said we would pay any price, he wasn't thinking about billions of dollars on pallets going into Iraq, or KBR electrocute you, the story that you have in here of Miss
Ryan Massif.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
What has happened?
Well, I mean, I think we've had this period of 13 years since 9/11, where if you think back to immediately after 9/11, whether we thought it was going to be a search for justice or a search for retribution or whatever you thought right after 9/11 we were going to be doing, 13 years later it's become like a search for cash and power and status, and we've developed a whole new mercenary class of people who are deeply invested in continuous war. And I think one of the problems was immediately after 9/11, you remember Dick Cheney said, we're going to take the gloves off. What that really meant, in hindsight, it's clear now, was that we were going to deregulate national security, much like we deregulated the banking industry. And at the same time we deregulated national security, by which I mean we took all the reforms, we took off all of the rules and regulations governing national security that had been in place since the 1970s. And we, at the same time, poured hundreds of billions of dollars into building up a much larger national security apparatus than we'd ever had before. And so we had deregulated it, at the same time we were pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into it. And that led what I call a national security crisis, very much like the banking crisis, except that we've never identified it in the same way. And that led to enormous unintended consequences. And I don't think anyone at the time of 9/11 expected that we would be transforming our society because of it.
Yeah. You talk about the deregulation, and in the book you talk about, it was fascinating to see the word oligarchs and the Brothers Blue and all these stories. But it really wasn't de jure deregulation. It wasn't that Congress met and said, we're going to blow off all these laws. This was just de facto deregulation, which arguably is a crime, is it not, if the government decides it's not going to follow its own rules?
That was the point of our story on the warrantless wiretapping. Was that the Bush administration had just decided to ignore the rules, ignore the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of the 1970s. And there were any number of other things like that. The Enhanced Interrogation Program ignored the fact that torture was a felony in the United States and that it was an international war crime. The way they got around that was by getting Justice Department memos in secret that said that this was not torture, and that it was could be legally approved under the United States laws.
So you and Bybee.
Right. And so you're right. No one ever went to Congress and said openly, let's change all our rules governing national security. They didn't want to have that kind of public debate. And so they found ways around it. And Congress, because of the political climate in which they thought that you had to do whatever it took to fight terrorism, they either turned a blind eye or went along with it and didn't require any real statutory changes for a very long time.
Right. And that was, I mean, there's an amazing story about your 2004, this research that you, was that with Eric Lichtblau?
Yeah.
That you guys had come up with, that the Bush administration was breaking the law.
Right.
And the New York Times would not allow you to print that before the election.
Right.
Had that been printed, would John Kerry be president? And was that part of the equation that both the Times was doing and the Bush White House?
I don't know. I mean, people have always asked me whether I thought it would have changed the election. I have no idea, but all I know is the facts, that we had the story ready to go a couple weeks before the election, and the Bush White House and the CIA and the NSA all told the editors of the New York Times that publishing the story would damage national security, that the NSA domestic spying was the crown jewel of their counterterrorism efforts, and so they decided not to run it.
Now, this was the secret of secrets. This was the ultimate secret that the government was holding. How did you come across this?
Well, both Eric and I had sources who told us that there was something really big going on, but they were too nervous to talk about it. And it took us quite a while to piece together exactly what was happening, and when we did, then we had the story ready to go eventually. But we had to talk to a lot of different people.
Right. Well, and eventually you had to write it into your book in order to get it in print. Did you?
Right. Yeah. The New York Times decided not to run it before the election, and then after the election, as I write in the new book, they had allowed us to try and convince them again after the election to run it. And we did more reporting and more rewriting and editing. And then I think it was in December of 2004, the paper killed it again, with the Bush administration again saying that it would damage national security. And in 2005, I went on a book leave and wrote a book, State of War, and put that into the book, and then I told the New York Times it was going to be in the book. And
so you might as well publish it now.
So eventually, after a lot of very traumatic back and forth, they eventually did. Yeah. So
when this can't be the first time that our government has turned criminal, turned rogue. I mean, you look back at the Nixon years, but Nixon's administration fell as a result of it. Frank Church aggressively investigated that. Congress passed all kinds of laws as a consequence of it. It played out very differently this time.
Yeah.
Were there, in the Nixon administration, you had a few people who at least eventually came around. John Dean is the kind of the public face of it. The guy who came out and said, okay, well, I'll tell you what's going on.
Right.
Did the people in the intelligence services in the United States who were tasked with implementing this illegal surveillance of American citizens, which is basically what your story was about in 2004, were they pushing back?
Some of them were, and some of them are, our sources were people in the government who were deeply troubled by what they knew and what was going on. They believed it was unconstitutional, illegal, and possibly unconstitutional. So there were some people who were upset about it, who were deeply troubled, so that they spoke out.
Has the Obama administration significantly reversed those policies or those violations of policy?
No, not at all. In fact, I think that's to me, what we wrote about, Eric and I, in the New York Times in 2005 was kind of the broad outlines of the NSA domestic spying program, both the NSA listening to phone calls and the content and reading emails, and also gathering metadata from those, from calls and from emails. What I think Edward Snowden revealed when he started leaking his documents was how much larger that program had grown since then. I think that's the fundamental thing I take away from what he revealed, was that the growth of social media and the online presence of American citizens and foreigners had grown so dramatically between 2005 and 2013 that the NSA had secretly been shadowing that growth and had been exploiting and taking advantage of it, so that the ability of the NSA to electronically surveil the lives of Americans, and foreigners, had grown dramatically, and that's kind of what he revealed.
It's remarkable stuff. More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Rising right after the break.
Let's get something straight. John F. O'Donnell will do anything to piss off corporate vampires. Sam Sachs used to work on the Hill. Now he can smell a lobbyist from a mile away. Yeah, have a nice one. And I'm Lee Camp. I came here to throw truth in the faces of the powerful, because the truth is irresistible. Well, not to everyone.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Dramas that can't be ignored. Stories others refuse to notice. Faces changing the world right now. A full picture of today's news. Live, on demand, from around the globe. Rockley.tv.
Welcome back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Risen, author of the new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Billions of dollars. I remember I was doing radio back when the stories first came out, back in 2004, I think it was, that we were first hearing about this, that there was enough cash being delivered to Iraq that you could actually see it from outer space. It was visible on surveillance satellites.
Yeah.
You know, these pallets of $100 bills, billions of dollars of physical cash that the Bush administration was flying in on C-130s or whatever, C-17, thank you, into Iraq and saying, "Here, guys."
Right.
And now we're discovering that a bunch of it is showing up in Lebanon. You talk about this in the book. Tell us the story.
Yeah, as you said, the Bush administration and the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was the U.S.-led occupation government right after the invasion in 2003, decided to send between $12 and $14 billion in $100 bills from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, East Rutherford, New Jersey currency facility to Baghdad. And this cash was coming from Iraqi government accounts. Right after the invasion, the UN had set up a fund to hold all of the Iraqi oil revenues that were coming from Iraqi oil sales. The cash was trucked from New Jersey to Andrews Air Force Base, where it was flown to Baghdad International Airport, and then convoys would meet it and truck it to the Green Zone or to the Iraq Central Bank. And then a lot of it, after it arrived, disappeared. And there was very poor accounting, and there was rumors and for years that a lot of it had been stolen. And no one seemed to be too curious about what had happened about this. And so I was looking into it and found that Stuart Bowen, the Special Inspector General for Iraq, had also been very obsessed with this money, and that he in fact had tracked it down and had found that almost $2 billion in cash had been stolen and moved to a bunker in Lebanon, where it was being hidden by these powerful Iraqis and probably some Lebanese that they were working with. And to Bowen's dismay, no one in the U.S. government showed much interest in this when he found out about it during the Obama administration.
Wow.
And so they never went after it.
So it's still there, or it's been distributed now to...
We don't know exactly where it is.
Converted to gold or diamonds.
Right.
God only knows.
Right.
Apropos of that, you're talking about L. Paul Bremer in the beginning of this whole process.
Right.
I interviewed several different people. I'm trying to remember who the reporters were. There was some really good reporting on Bremer and Wolfowitz and these guys who were, in addition to being neoconservatives, they were also libertarians economically. They believed the kind of Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman idea that if you basically destroyed all government function and created a vacuum, what would step into that vacuum are good capitalists who would create a paradise. And this had, there's never been a libertarian success story in the history of Earth.
Right.
And so one of the things that Bremer was actually trying to do, and one of the reasons he shut down all the government operations and laid off the military, things that seemed irrational, was to prepare the way, to make that fertile ground, and Rumsfeld talked about it, democracy's messy, that they were rebooting the country so that the capitalists could come in, or the homegrown capitalists would arise, and then they could say, ta-da, it works. Is that an accurate analysis?
Well, I don't know about all that. I do know that, as I quote one Treasury Department official in the book, he went to some meetings for before the invasion in Washington, where they were supposed to be doing post-war planning. or reconstruction planning, and he told me that he was kind of shocked by how much Republican ideology was seeping into the ideas for post-war planning, and how they wanted to, that they didn't want to listen to the kind of experience that he had in reconstruction and other financial and economic reconstruction he had in other countries. And one of the things I remember was that there were people who wanted to impose a flat tax in Iraq because they weren't able to do it here. They thought they could try it there.
Right.
So,
yeah, there was actually a kind of a punch list, a libertarian punch list at the time. But it's also that kind of psychology. There's just this enormous amount of government money. Let's throw it at the private sector. They'll make things well. Right. One of the members of the private sector who came forward and said, I've got a secret. I can figure this stuff out, was a guy by the name of Dennis Montgomery. Tell us his story.
Dennis Montgomery is one of the best stories of the whole war on terror. I think somebody should make a movie about him. Dennis Montgomery was a computer software expert who said that he had developed technology that basically could find objects hidden in the video on television. And so he convinced, through a whole series of contacts and meetings that I detail in the book, he was able to get to the CIA and convince the CIA that he had the technology to decipher al-Qaeda codes that he said were hidden in Al Jazeera news broadcasts.
They were hidden in the Chiron,
in the banner, actually. He said that he could find numbers and letters that were constantly showing up, or not showing up, but being hidden, embedded deeply in the video, and that he would then give these numbers and letters to the CIA, and the CIA, either he told them or they convinced themselves that these numbers and letters corresponded to flights, international airline flights that al-Qaeda was going to attack. And so in Christmas 2003, the Bush administration and the CIA took this so seriously that they actually grounded a whole series of international flights coming into and out of the United States. And the White House even considered shooting down some of those flights over the Atlantic.
Wow.
And once the CIA later was convinced by French intelligence that this was all a fabrication and that this kind of technology didn't exist and that these supposed al-Qaeda codes weren't really in the Al Jazeera newscasts, the CIA covered the whole thing up and never went public with it and just tried to act like it never happened.
Well, we know how aggressively this, and particularly the Obama administration right now, has gone after whistleblowers and reporters. Right. You would think that they would also go after people who scammed the CIA. I mean, if one of us walked in off the street to the CIA and said, hey, we got a deal for you, and it was just total lie, and they gave us millions of dollars, which they gave to Dennis Montgomery, you'd think he'd end up in prison.
No, he ended up getting more contracts from the military and the Pentagon. And he was he continued to operate for several years. And it's really a remarkable story.
Yeah, it really and truly is. The American Psychological Association, according to your book, you talk about how they helped the Bush administration justify torture. Am I?
Well, I would say the psychological profession writ large helped. What I have a chapter in my book about the whole torture issue. And I start with a profile of an Army interrogator named Damien Corsetti, who was involved with harsh interrogation both in Afghanistan and at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And he came home with PTSD because of his involvement with interrogations. And so I tried to contrast what happened to him, the person who actually was down in these cells, actually doing the interrogation, with a number of the people higher up in the system, the lawyers and the politicians and the behavioral scientists, who in various ways profited or were standing above this whole interrogation program and approved it or endorsed it or looked the other way while it went on. And Corsetti was this low-level guy who eventually was prosecuted and then acquitted for some of his actions at Bagram in Afghanistan. But all of these other people and the whole rest of this interrogation regime, many of them got rich, and many of them, have gone on to, greater fame and glory.
Yeah, I thought that was...
That's what, to me, the psychological profession played a key role, because the behavioral science involvement with the enhanced interrogation program was critical. Behavioral scientists, the role of a behavioral scientist and psychologist was to provide the Justice Department the ability to allow the Justice Department to say, this is not torture because we've been told by behavioral scientists it's not torture. And in addition, we have psychologists and behavioral scientists there on the scene who are monitoring this, so we know it's legal and it's not torture. And the question really is, if those behavioral scientists and psychologists and other professionals had not gotten involved and had not said either it's okay to be involved or we're going to monitor this to make sure it's safe and effective, the question is, could the Bush administration have gotten away with maintaining what we now call a torture regime?
And the Corsetti, this is one of the most poignant parts of your book. I mean, this guy ended up addicted to heroin. He was so violent toward his wife, she couldn't be in the room with him. She got a restraining order. He ended up 300 pounds. He had a monster tattooed on his stomach. I mean, it was an amazing, amazing story. And you contrast that with these guys living in these mansions in the rings, the suburbs ringing around Washington, D.C.
Right. There's what I have a chapter in the book called the oligarchs of 9/11. These are the people who are very quiet, who have very quietly gotten really rich from the war on terror. They're not the loud and boisterous and noisy people like Eric Prince, who was the head of Blackwater, who flamed out because of the problems that Blackwater had. These are the people who have more quietly benefited from the war on terror, like the Blue brothers, whose company built the Predator drone and the Reaper drone, and at the same time they are very politically conservative and argue against federal spending at the same time that their company has, I think, their federal contracting, defense contracting, has ballooned throughout the war on terror.
Yeah, so these guys got just insanely rich off this war on terror, and people like Mr. Corsetti just got destroyed, and not to mention the Iraqis. More of tonight's conversations with the great minds of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Arisen right after the break.
The fact that so many lawmakers are siding with the industry has prompted independent journalists to take innovative approaches to shed light on the horrific conditions at factory farms.
I saw some photos from satellite. As I was seeing those, I was thinking, well, what would happen if we could get even closer? If we had a drone that could actually be over these farms documenting what's happening? I think the fact that they're already freaking out about this and it's just the Kickstarter page really reflects that I think we're onto something.
And welcome back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist James Risen, author of the new book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. Tell us about Rosetta.
Rosetta is the name of a chapter I have in a book where I describe this very weird intelligence activities that that to me is like a case study for kind of how bizarre the war on terror became. There's a law firm in Charleston, South Carolina, Motley Rice, which was run by a guy named Ron Motley, who was famous for defeating the tobacco industry in the 1990s. And he made a fortune from the tobacco settlement. And then after that, he was kind of drifting and looking for something new to do. And after 9/11, he began to represent the 9/11 families. And he filed a huge class action lawsuit against Saudi Arabia, claiming that the Saudis helped finance the war, the 9/11 attacks. And in order to prove his case, he wanted to create his own little intelligence operation. And he hired some people who were involved to do that, including people who seemed to be at the same time working for the U.S. government and who had very strange connections to different agencies in the government. And so the whole chapter is an attempt to decipher what exactly was going on between the investigation for the lawsuit and the role these people seemed to be playing for the government. And it kind of climaxed this whole intertwined connections between the investigation for the lawsuit and the role they might or might not be playing for the government, all climaxed when the investigators for the lawsuit were involved in what you might call a rendition of an Afghan drug lord to the United States on behalf of the Drug Enforcement Administration. They lured him to the United States, and then he was arrested, and he's now in jail in New York. And this was, you know, the U.S. government tried to keep hidden the fact that these contractors, these investigators for this law firm, were actually doing this, for all intents and purposes, was an intelligence operation for the U.S. government. And so it's a very weird, complicated story that just raises all kinds of questions about what is real in the war on terror and what's concoction.
Well, what is real and what's concoction?
That's what I try. To me, that's the central question of the war on terror. We are fighting an unending war against an abstraction. Terrorism is not an enemy so much as an action. And so how do you ever win the war on terror?
Right. One group steps out, another group steps in. Hi, we've got ISIS this week.
Right. And so that's the problem. To me, it's kind of like the war on drugs. I mean, how do you know you won the war on drugs? How do you know you won the war on terror? Right. And it's an unending mission, and we are politically at a point in our country where we don't want to ever admit that that you have to be a little more skeptical about what we're doing, because if you do, you don't want to be called soft on terrorism.
Yeah. Well, 1984, George Orwell's famous book, is about an unending war.
Right.
Their country is a perpetual war. Right. James Madison, back in 1794, said no nation can survive a state of perpetual warfare. He pointed out it was the most corrosive of all things because it increased the power of the presidency and decreased the power. He went through the whole rationale.
Right.
But are we there?
Well, I think we're at a dangerous point, I think, where we have spent, as I said, 13 years building up a huge new national security state. And the question is, when does this national security state that we've created become a political constituency unto itself? And I think we're seeing some of that, where examples are like where the CIA doesn't want to do what the Senate Intelligence Committee wants it to do. And so it begins to spy on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Those are cases where, the growth of this national security apparatus is beginning to overshadow the people who are supposed to oversee it.
And it seems to me, the last chapter of your book about some of the whistleblowers and some of the things that have happened, Diane Moor's story, for example, that if this was not an out-of-control situation, if we were a nation of laws, if we were conducting ourselves the way that we at least tried to in the mid-'70s and as a consequence of the horrors of the Nixon administration, her story would be very different, would it not? Tell us about Diane Moore.
Diane Moore is really one of my heroes in the book. She was the House Intelligence Committee staffer assigned to oversee the NSA at the time of 9/11. And soon after 9/11, she was told by people in the NSA that the NSA had begun a large secret domestic spying operation and spying on Americans. And she was outraged, and she realized that this was illegal and possibly unconstitutional. And she went to her bosses in the House Intelligence Committee and to warn the chairman and the ranking member of the committee that this was going on, because she thought at first this was some kind of rogue operation. But soon after she started going to all these powerful people inside the government to warn them about what was going on, she began to realize that they all knew about it, that this was authorized at the highest levels of the government, and that it was going around the law, and that a lot of people inside the government were going along with it. And she went all the way, she had a very dramatic confrontation with the NSA's director, Mike Hayden, where she told him she thought it was illegal and unconstitutional, and he told her, well, we'll have the majority of 9. And she took that to mean if it ever becomes public, and if it ever, is questioned, the legality is questioned, we will have at least 5 Supreme Court justices who will be on our side. And so then she rushed to try and get a message to Chief Justice William Rehnquist, because she thought, here's the last gasp, the last person I could try to get a message to before Hayden gets to him. And she sent a message and never heard back, and she retired kind of depressed by the whole situation, but she never leaked to the press. She just retired quietly. And then when our story came out in the New York Times about the existence of this program, the FBI raided her house and persecuted her.
They thought she was your source.
She thought she was our source, which she was not.
Right. And are they still going after her?
I think they've no longer going after her, but her life was turned upside down as a result.
Yeah, that's amazing. Back to Rosetta for just a second. You mentioned this fellow who was trying to, who was suing on behalf of the 9/11 family, saying that Saudi Arabia had financed 9/11. Did they?
Oh, there's all kinds of questions back and forth about what the role of Saudis were in 9/11.
Is this that 38-page memo that?
Well, that's one of the issues. Has been the joint inquiry by the Senate and House over 9/11, which predated the 9/11 Commission. Some pages of it about Saudi involvement have been redacted and never been made public. So there's still questions about the role of either wealthy individual Saudis or the Saudi government that have never been fully answered.
It's remarkable stuff. You make a comparison between the Homeland Security industrial complex and the too big to fail banks.
Right.
And also suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, or if I'm misinterpreting this, that when Dwight Eisenhower warned us about the military industrial complex, he couldn't even imagine a military intelligence complex.
Right. I think what I say is that the Homeland Security industrial complex is different from the old Cold War military industrial complex. It's, back in the Cold War, they were building nuclear weapons and big planes and ships and submarines, things that, big weapon systems. Now, the Homeland Security industrial complex is more about secret contractors working on intelligence programs, finding ways to help on counterterrorism. And that's really more contracting about secret computer programs or secret operations inside the CIA or the Pentagon. And so it's much more difficult to detect and see for the public what this new complex is doing. And yet it's grown dramatically over time. And all you have to do is drive up and down the Dulles Toll Road and you'll see all these office buildings where these secretive contractors are operating.
Right. And this is the Supreme Court essentially in Citizens United and other decisions, I mean, we can go all the way back to Buckley, a series of decisions have legalized purchasing of politicians. And in some industries, it's quite visible. It's quite obvious. The oil industry, for example, the tobacco industry 20 years ago. You knew which politicians were in the pocket of what industry. I mean, sometimes they just come right out and say it. The reports are there. To what extent is this industry, this intelligence industry, this homeland security industry, now getting its own captive members of Congress? And is there good
Well, I don't think
reporting?
they even need to. In the war on terror, it's so difficult for any politician to say that they're soft on terrorism. I don't even think, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot going on, but I don't think you even need to. All you have to do is run a campaign ad against somebody saying you're soft on terrorism, and the first thing they'll say is, no, I'm not. I'm voting for everything, for the FBI, the Pentagon, the CIA. There is virtually no pushback on funding for counterterrorism programs anywhere. And so that's one of the problems. Politically, it's a loser to be called skeptical on the war on terror, because immediately you'll say, well, what do you want to do? You want to allow another terrorist attack? And so, you know, that's the great problem in American politics today, in my opinion, is we are allowing all of this to keep going, and a lot of Americans say, I don't really want to know, I don't care, as long as they keep me safe. And so that allows just an enormous amount of waste, fraud, and abuse to go on without any real oversight.
Yeah, and that puts us in a terrible box. Your book is an extraordinarily important contribution to this conversation. Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War. James Risen, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
To see this and other conversations with great minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com. And that's the way it is for tonight, Thursday, October 23rd, 2014. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it.